Good afternoon, evening, or morning, depending upon the time of day in your particular location. Welcome to the launch of the Leo Institute series in Chinese Christianities and the launch of Schism, Seventh-day Adventism in Post-Denominational China by Christie Chui-Shan Chow. We are so delighted that we have valued colleagues and participants from around the world, and we can celebrate our connectivity virtually as a global community. My name is Jonathan Noble, and I'm honored to be serving as the interim director for the Leo Institute for Asia and Asian Studies. The Leo Institute is one of 9 international institutes that comprise the Keough School of Global Affairs. The Leo Institute's main objectives include coordinating Asian studies research and teaching across the university, encouraging Notre Dame students to study Asia, which is now more important than ever, promoting academic collaboration with Asian universities, and organizing public events pertaining to Asia, such as this one that is co-sponsored by Notre Dame Press. Just to give you a bit of information about the University of Notre Dame Press, it is the largest Catholic university press in the world and publishes academic and general interest books that engage the most enduring questions of our time. Notre Dame Press primarily publishes in areas that align with the academic strengths of the university, such as religion. We at the Leo Institute were absolutely thrilled when Notre Dame Press approached the Institute last October to propose what has now become the Leo Institute series in Chinese Christianities. This is particularly important to the Leo Institute because the Institute has hosted numerous events that examine religion in Asia, especially Catholicism, throughout the Institute's history. So this series is the perfect program to elevate and broaden the Leo Institute's efforts to support research on a diverse range of religions in Asia. Finally, I'd like to briefly introduce Professor Alexander Xu, my valued colleague and our moderator for this important event. A historian of early Buddhist scripture in China, Professor Xu earned a doctorate in religious studies from the University of Chicago. He wears several hats at the Keough School, supporting both the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion and the Leo Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, where he serves as the Institute's academic advisor, and plays an instrumental role in building the Institute's curricula related to Asia. He also plays an important role in educating students at Notre Dame about non-Western religions by teaching courses such as Introduction to Buddhism and Engaging Religions. Now, I'm honored to turn the event over to the moderator, Professor Xu.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan, for your introduction. I'm delighted to be your moderator and timekeeper for the hour. I'll be introducing our panelists in speaking order, who will each speak for 5 to 10 minutes. We'll finish with a 20-minute Q&A with the author and conclude promptly at 1 p.m. So keep those questions burbling in your mind. First, we will hear from Dr. Alexander Chow, Senior Lecturer in Theology and World Christianity at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Chow is the author of 2 books, Biosis, Sino-Christian Theology in the Second Chinese Enlightenment, and Chinese Public Theology, Generational Shifts and Confucian Imagination in Chinese Christianity, along with many, many articles. He's the co-director of the Center for the Study of World Christianity, co-editor of the journal Studies in World Christianity, and we are proud to say, as Jonathan just mentioned, the editor of the Liu Institute series in Chinese Christianities with the University of Notre Dame Press. Dr. Chow will tell us all about this brand new book series and its inaugural title, Schism. Hello, Alexander. Second, we will hear from the author herself, Dr. Christie Chui-Shan Chow, an independent scholar of global Christianity and Chinese religions, who received her doctorate in religion and society from Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Chow will share with us how she came to write Schism and what we can all learn from it. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Hi, Christie. Finally, Dr. Chris White, the Assistant Director at Purdue University's Center on Religion and Chinese Society. Dr. White's research focuses on Chinese Christians in southern Fujian province from the late 19th century to today. He's the author of the monograph Sacred Webs, The Social Lives and Networks of Minnan Protestants, 1840s through 1920, and he's published many articles and book chapters on the history of Chinese Christianity. Dr. White will speak about broader concerns that Dr. Chow's book can help us talk and think about. Hi, Chris. So with our panelists introduced, I give the floor to our series editor, Dr. Alexander Chow.
First, may I extend a huge thanks to the Liu Institute. In many ways, this is a double launch, two for the price of one. It's a launch of Christie's wonderful book, Schism, and a launch of the Liu Institute's series in Chinese Christianities. Without the Liu Institute, we really would not be able to have this event or the series. I should also, of course, extend a huge thanks to the University of Notre Dame Press. This series has been many years in the making, and I've been incredibly grateful for the efforts by various members of the press in making this series happen. So thank you also to the press. Now, though we are online, I'd like everyone in attendance to consider this question. How would you translate the phrase Chinese Christianity? Now, obviously, this works best if you know Chinese, but if you know any other language, you could think about it as well. Now, when I ask this question, many Chinese speakers probably immediately render the phrase 中国基督教. The second part, Christianity, may seem simple enough, but when we use this phrase 基督教, this primarily refers to Protestantism. In Chinese, Catholicism is rendered using a different term, and it's the same thing with Orthodoxy. But the first part is no less difficult to translate. If we use the phrase 中国, this is implying the modern nation state of China. It doesn't necessarily encompass Chinese outside of mainland China, say in the United States or in the United Kingdom. In essence, the English phrase Chinese Christianity, or perhaps Chinese Christianities in the plural, implies multiple understandings of Chineseness and multiple understandings of Christianity. So as Notre Dame Press and I began discussions about the series and later in conversations with the Liu Institute, we really wanted a series title that captures the multifaceted nature of the academic field. And this is really important because if we survey the various book series out there on Chinese Christianity, most of them tend to focus on one ecclesial grouping, Protestantism or Catholicism, or one region, mainland China, or Asian America, or wherever. We really wanted to push the limits of this way of thinking. And if we take hold of multiple expressions of Chineseness and Christianities, we are met with new and deeper understandings of this manifold picture of Chinese Christianities. Now, along with Christie's book, we have a number of projects lined up. We have a volume that's looking at the nature of the academic field of sinology, which is often seen as a study of Chinese language and culture. But this book pushes back on this to the origins in Anglophone context, really connected to the efforts of Protestant missionaries and the Chinese they encounter. We have another volume looking at Chinese Catholic intellectuals in China. While we often think about exciting and novel Catholic theologies coming after Vatican II, This volume focuses on pre-Vatican II Chinese Catholics and how they express unique responses to their context from within the parameters they are offered. Another exciting volume in the works is one that goes beyond China and looks at Cantonese-speaking Christians across the Pacific Rim, San Francisco, Vancouver, Hong Kong. It offers a brilliant transnational study of the place of Chinese Christianities in secular civil societies. So what we see in each of these volumes are ways in which we can push the boundaries of what is used to define and sometimes constrict Chinese Christianity. And we are introduced to new ways to conceive of and reconceive the multiplicity of Chinese Christianities. Of course, we also have Christie's wonderful volume, Schism. This book looks at the mainland Chinese context, especially since the 1970s, where Chinese Protestants have tended to champion how denominational differences were done away with into a post-denominational era. But Christie's book, Schism, speaks about Adventism in China. On the one hand, Adventism operates within the state-sanctioned Three Self-Patriotic movement and offers an alternative post-denominational denomination, if you will. But it also experienced divisions, schisms, offering a much more complex picture of what Chinese Protestantism looks like. I'm really excited about this series, but I'm also really proud of Christie and this wonderful book she has written. It opens up so many new questions around the neat boxes we often hear about Protestantism in China or about Christianity and Chinese Christianities on a global level. So I'm really thankful to the Liu Institute and to Notre Dame Press for launching this series. Thank you very much for your time. Do get in contact if you or somebody else would like to talk more about the series. Thank you.
Thank you for introducing this series. We heard from Alexander that this is going to be a contribution to the field and expand our understanding of Chinese Christianities. And before I share with you the journey of writing my book, I would like to start by thanking the Liu Institute for launching this academic series. And also the series significance lies in the fact that it's not just a book series, but it's a collaborative project in partnership with the Notre Dame Press. And so let me begin by telling you the reason for this book. So the book began with a personal quest for my own religious root, because I myself is a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Hong Kong. And as shown in the slide, that the middle slide is the church where I spent my adulthood and young adulthood in Hong Kong. So being an Adventist, I'm always curious about how this American Protestant faith came to the other side of the globe. But as a scholar of Chinese religions and world Christianity, I think that looking at the story of Chinese Seventh-day Adventism is important for three reasons. The first reason is the Chinese Adventists are one of the key contributors to the global Christian church growth. Today, there are over 400,000 Seventh-day Adventists in mainland China. And this group of Protestant believers makes up part of the Chinese Christianity and the global church. But very little work has been done on this Protestant minority. And I think their story needs to be told because their voices constitute part of the larger story of the church. Next slide, please. Now, the second reason is that the story of Chinese Adventists help us better understand the development of Protestant Christianities in China during the Maoist and the Reform eras. So usually a familiar argument about Chinese Christianity is that the contemporary Chinese church represent a rupture from the past. And especially it is widely held that Chinese Protestant life from the 1950s onward has been truly independent and indigenous mainly because, according to this argument, Chinese Christians are no longer under the influence and control of the foreign missionaries. But then if we buy into that argument, then how do we explain a phenomenon in China where American Adventist doctrines and practices continue to define this group of believers' identity and ecclesiology? So I believe that we need to study the patterns of continuity and change in Chinese Christianities. And studying Adventism opens up a conversation about how some Adventist believers still follow the doctrines and practices they inherit from the missionaries, but also how they also struggle to retain and revise them to meet the challenge of their religious life. And so the first reason is, writing this book, I think that Chinese Adventists help us challenge the common discourse that describe the Chinese church as post-denominational. So in the Chinese context, the prefix post means non, fei. Okay, so post-denominational Chinese church, literally translated into China, is 后宗派中国教会. But in practice, it is 非宗派中国教会. The Chinese church has no boundaries, no internal borders. The Chinese church is a monolithic entity, and there's no differences found in this church. And I think that is a misrepresentation of the Chinese Christian life. So if we look at how Chinese Christians practice their faith on the ground, so it comes in a new methodology to look at the Chinese church, to look at them on the ground, how they practice their faith from the bottom up. And in the case of the Seventh-day Adventists, some Christian believers strongly identify themselves as a unique denomination, and they want to live their church life as such. So in the book, I argue that a denominational perspective helps problematize the simple notion of post-denominational Chinese church. So my book began with a detailed account of the Adventist mission history in modern China. Then I traced the religious schism of the Adventists in Wenzhou, East China. So Wenzhou is a coastal Chinese city, famous for a higher concentration of Protestant population. I picked the region because my case study helped me to understand the Adventist schism first happened there, and then it spread to other parts of China. So at the end of the day, a local Wenzhou Adventist phenomenon turned out to have significant national implications for this religious movement. Next slide, please. In addition, writing about the Adventist schism in connection with denominationalism allows me to portray Adventism as a dynamic Protestant faith. So very generally, people talked about state repression, okay? But I believe we need to remember that Chinese Christians are real people, and they have agency. In particular, when it comes to being faithful to what they believe, sometimes such belief is so strong that they would go so far as to divide the church to protect what they believe to be orthodox. So in the slide, in the right-hand side, you can see two Adventist church, very similar in terms of their outlook. And they represent the Adventist population in this tiny little village. And I document the process of how they become two separate Adventist community in this tiny little village, and how that process began, and how the factors of personal clashes and also government intervention became so prominent in this process of dividing the church. Something about the methodology of researching the research for this book. So this book is based on my ethnographic and archival research in China during 2010. It documents 4 branches of Wenzhou Adventists, and I put the Adventist schisms in the context of a changing China from the 1970s to 2000s, when the country was reopening to the outside world in the late 1970s, when China was coping the traumas of failed pro-democracy movement after 1989, and when Chinese people were navigating the path of capitalization and urbanization from the 90s to 2000s. So during these decades, there was a relatively higher level of freedom for people to organize their public religious life. There was a time for social activism for people to protect their citizens' rights, of which the Wenzhou Adventist churches were also involved in defining their rights to own properties and to organize their worshiping space. That period of transition also coincides with the decade of rule of law, when the government introduced more rules to regulate the religious life. And so what I hope this book contributes to the field is it offers a new lens through which to interpret the Chinese Christian experience, a lens that takes into account differences in Chinese Christian faith and practice, a denominational lens, which I discussed in my book, helps us to understand and appreciate different aspects of Chinese Christian communities. And today, denominationalism is still present in Chinese churches. And if you want to learn more about that, you may want to read my book. If Chinese Christianity is a jigsaw puzzle, which is my favorite metaphor for thinking about the dynamic of the Chinese church, a jigsaw puzzle, then the Adventist denomination is a significant component. And with this puzzle piece, I believe, we can better understand the totality and the vitality of the Chinese history. So this is my personal story of writing Schism, and I look forward to hearing from the panelists and your feedback on the book. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Christie, for sharing those remarks. And my thanks to the Liu Institute for organizing this event, and my gratitude to Notre Dame Press for this series on Chinese Christianities. The use of the plural Christianities highlights the diversity and complexity found in churches and groups within Chinese communities that begs for greater scholarly analysis. And no more perfect way to start this series than with Christie Chow's book, Schism. Today, I would like to offer a couple general thoughts on how this study adds to our understanding of Chinese Christianities, then talk about some specific ways the deep ethnographic experiences the book yields can challenge future studies on Chinese churches or Christians. I'll end with a couple questions that I hope Dr. Chow can respond to. At the World Missionary Conference held in Edinburgh in 1910, Chinese church leader Cheng Jingyi proclaimed to his captivated audience that, quote, "Denominationalism has never interested the Chinese mind," end quote. Many Westerners appreciated these remarks and saw China as a new land where church unity was the default norm. I had similar sentiments when I first went to China in 1999 as a student and was told that churches in the country were post-denominational. Coming from small town Midwest America, where many churches were within walking distance of others, but rarely over half filled, this idea seemed quite attractive and fit within the romanticized picture of China I was forming. This apparent unity was one more way the West could learn from the East. It did not take long before I realized that reality was much more complicated. The large urban church I attended in Shandong was distinctly different from the churches I had visited in Shanghai. For instance, in the Shandong church, men and women were not permitted to sit together. 2/3 of the seating was reserved and packed with females, and the other third was men and mostly empty seats. This strict separation was a carryover from a pre-PRC church policy before China turned post-denominational. There are numerous ways denominational backgrounds are evident in many Chinese churches today, Some of these are theological, but many are practice-based. The placement of a pulpit on the stage, the method of baptism, or the decoration of the church often reveal links with church practices from the late 19th or early 20th century. However, the denominational divisions are no more evident than in the smaller subgroupings of Chinese Christianity, such as the Little Flock, True Jesus Church, or Seventh-day Adventist, the topic of Chow's research. This book makes evident the claim of post-denominationalism in China is not accurate and very superficial at best. Church affairs are messy, and untangling them requires extensive fieldwork, patience, and a healthy measure of grace. Christie Chow's book shows this. It reveals that not only is Adventism a distinct group within Chinese Christianity, the denomination itself is divided into factions. In fact, and it may seem counterintuitive, it is through schisms that Adventists have been able to preserve unique beliefs and practices. The conservative, reformist, wilderness, and wheat field factions detailed by Chow have unique theologies and practices that partition the nearly 500,000 Adventists in China. Nevertheless, Chow successfully argues that the common ground beliefs and practices, such as worshiping on Saturdays, dietary restrictions, reverence for Ellen White, the denomination's spiritual pioneer, and eschatological focus, make Adventists a distinct denomination in China and provide points of connection with Adventists worldwide. This is not to say Chinese Adventists have not been influenced by non-Adventist groups. They have. For instance, Chow clearly shows how the Little Flock practices of praying have had lasting impact on some Adventist congregations today. Similarly, by presenting the wheat field Adventist as having a hybrid identity, Chow suggests that there are strong motivations among some groups to make compromises with non-Adventist groups. The unique positioning of Adventists on the fringes of both the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, or TSPM, and global Adventist organizations provided space for splits to occur in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. In reading this book, it seems clear the freedom or independence, whether this be non-involvement of government forces, the largely hands-off approach from the TSPM, or the ecclesial disconnect with global Adventist organizations, allowed for or even promoted schisms in the 1980s and 90s. Now, let me touch on 3 important themes found within this book that add to our understanding of Chinese Christianity and are poignant challenges for future scholars to consider as they research Chinese Christianities. First, this study muddies the water between TSPM and house churches, or unregistered bodies. Despite the neat boundaries found within some portrayals of churches in China, coming from scholars, journalists, or outside evangelistic organizations, there is considerable overlap, or at least gray areas, between registered churches and those affiliated with the TSPM. Between registered churches or those affiliated with the TSPM and unregistered groups, often called house churches or even underground churches. Some Adventist churches are part of the TSPM, some are not. The Wilderness faction has resolutely refused to affiliate with Babylon or the TSPM, and registration is framed as a form of spiritual warfare. Other Adventist groups have tried to register with the state, but not under the auspices of the TSPM. The strong desire to preserve denominational identity is apparent in these attempts. Many of those churches that do choose to affiliate with the TSPM continue to publicly promote their Adventist identity, such as by including Anxi, the Chinese name for Adventism, in their signage, or by showing the SDA symbol. Near where I lived in the city of Xiamen for 12 years was a registered True Jesus Church. The sign on the outside of the building in Chinese simply said, 连前教会, or 连前 Church. This was the legal name of the church, void of any denominational distinguisher, and the only name they were permitted to formally use. However, in English, the sign also read True Jesus Church. This creative way of both adhering to the policy but also promoting a group's unique identity, reveals the negotiation minority religious groups in China commonly experience. Chow's book is an important reminder that within registered and unregistered groups, there is a range of interactions and relationships with local state actors that lead to varying levels of acceptance and restriction. The creative ways these groups adapt to restrictions and nuance the negotiations to their identities they experience are important for scholars to recognize and acknowledge, as Chow has done. Second, Chow's book is a rare example of scholarship revealing how Christianity not only survived, but adapted and at times even expanded during the Cultural Revolution. Many observers of China assumed Christianity would die out after the communist victory in 1949. The party and government itself seemed to assume this would occur when they relaxed restrictions on religion and reopened churches at the start of the Reform era in the late 1970s. There were about 1 million Protestants in China in 1949. By the early years of the 1980s, there were about 3 million Protestants. Chow's book sheds light on how this growth occurred. For instance, she notes that in 1969, a revival service with 1,000 participants was held. This was during the height of the Cultural Revolution. Many of the activities conducted were covert, but Christian practice and interaction was not absent during the 1960s and 70s. Further studies need to investigate how individual Christians and church groups creatively negotiated the religious restrictions during these decades. Finally, the clear concern of many Christian groups for property, either what was owned before 1949 or the construction of newer buildings today, is a topic that has just begun to be explored by scholars of Chinese Christianity. This book makes evident that it deserves further attention. In particular, Chow shows that as a minority group within a minority religion, Adventists in China have learned to embrace a martyr narrative. And this is often presented through the prism of church property. A focus on land and fiscal matters may seem too secular for a study on a religious organization. But in my fieldwork in Fujian, it was much more common for discussions with church members and leaders to revolve around property and finances rather than theological issues. In closing, I would like to offer 2 pointed questions for Dr. Chow to consider. First, your research basically goes up to the year 2015. However, since that time, Christian churches in China have experienced new challenges and felt varying levels of pressure. How have Adventist churches responded to what some have billed as the new normal atmosphere of Xi Jinping's tenure? Specifically, have you seen differences in how conservative factions of Adventists who refuse to register with the TSPM and other groups that do have these connections to the state are treated? A final question I would pose relates to theological education. For those Adventist factions that have registered with the TSPM, pastors are required to go through official seminaries, which merge the various denominations found under the TSPM umbrella together. This forces interaction with non-Adventists, whether they be instructors or classmates. In your research, have you found this to affect the theology or practices of Adventist seminary students? What are some particular challenges Adventist students, as denominational minorities, may experience in seminaries? Once again, I thank the Liu Institute and Notre Dame Press for organizing this event, and I'm thrilled to see this series begin with such a welcomed addition to the scholarship on Chinese Christianities. Thank you.
Alex, Christie, Chris, thank you so much for getting this conversation started. We have about 26 minutes for Q&A. And how I'm going to run this is ask participants to please use the Q&A box at the bottom. We already have some questions coming in. We have some pre-submitted questions that I'd like to get to as well. But I think Christie can start us off by responding to Chris's. So Professor Christie Chow can respond to Professor Chris White's questions if she wants to right off the bat.
Thank you very much for the comments. And I think, Chris, you have done such a great job of summarizing my book. And even maybe your conceptualization and description is you made me feel that, oh, did I really write that book? But I think it's always interesting to hear other people to think and share how your work is. So thank you very much for this very generous comments. So the two questions that you pose to me, the first one is, how do today's Chinese Adventists respond to the new normal beginning in the Xi Jinping's era? And then in particular, we know that there has been a cross-denomination campaign happening in China. And in the aftermath of that campaign, there have been much more rules and regulations imposed on the meeting places, particularly the register venue that under the management of the Free Self-Patriotic Church. So how do the Chinese Adventists respond to those new normal? So interestingly, I would have anticipated that the wilderness group would have a much more vibrant resistance to those intervention. But the fact is, even the wilderness, who are very critical to the state regulations on their religious life, they are quite compliant to those rules. So if you are interested to this phenomena, there is one picture in my book that showed a new church established in a tiny little village, the church that the wilderness were so proud of, because that church is recognized by the local government, and the government allowed the Adventists to put up their denominational name on the church. But then if you look closely to the photo, you realize that there is a tiny little cross on the building, but it's not on the top of the building. Now, that is a result of the cross-demolition campaign. And even the wilderness, who have been very critical to the state intervention, they find themselves in a position that they have to comply to the new normal regulations so that they can protect their denominational identity in the public space. So that is one example. And for the reformists, the Whitefield ministry and also the conservative, all of them comply to any local state requirement that the Christian have to follow. So I think the challenges will be much more pronounced in the future, which I think people care about the Chinese church. Won't those things happen? But then what the new normal will take the Chinese Christian life in what direction, and that will lead them to head. That's something that we have to wait and see. Okay, so this is my little response to the first question. Now, the second question about the education of this minority Protestant community, and how do they navigate their relationship with other Protestant in the seminary. So in my book, I discussed how the Whitefield ministry, which is more progressive in terms of the theology and more critical to the traditional Adventist claims. So for this group, many of their church leaders received education from the patriotic seminaries. And oftentimes, the very challenge they find is not so much in the context of in the classroom or in the formal interaction in the seminary. Most of the time, the challenge is outside the classroom, which means the professor and their classmates will be very interested to know their background. They are ignorant to Adventist practices and beliefs, but because these Adventists are registered Christians, they have the right, they are allowed to study in a state managed seminary. And so their classmates have to treat them as equals in the classroom context. But outside that context, there will be interesting conversation. So for instance, in my book, I mentioned one episode that one Whitefield Adventist, he received a seminary education in Zhejiang. And then one day, a professor came up to him and asked him, so why are you still remain in this denomination? it looks like that you have a path to be out of this denomination because you are studying a mainstream Christian theology in a very famous seminary. But then that Whitfield Adventist responded that, well, I came to Christ through the Adventist denomination, and that is my family religion. And that tells you something about how they perceive their denominational background, even though they are in an educational context that have to deal with some misunderstandings. But then because the religious faith that they inherit is from the family. So there is the Chineseness, an aspects of a Chineseness in the Adventist life in mainland China. So this is my response to your second question. And I welcome other comments and questions.
Great. Well, we've already got some questions coming in from both accomplished scholars of Chinese Christianity and just interested people. I think I'd like to start with a pre-submitted question that I think can help address, bring more people to the conversation, which is from a US Christian perspective, there are several features of Seventh-day Adventism that stand out as unique. As Professor White mentioned, admiration for founder Ellen White, worship on a different day of the week, particular dietary practices, and a very unique eschatology. From a Chinese Christian perspective, are these the same features that stand out as unique?
Yes, great question. So what makes Chinese Adventism Chinese, right? Is it just because the fact that they hold a similar idioms that the global Adventist family embrace, right? So the question is yes and no. And so oftentimes when I talk to my Adventist informant and I invite them to describe why they perceive themselves as Chinese Adventists, right? What was the Chinese part and what is the Adventist part, right? So oftentimes they mention that, oh, we are Adventists because of we have the prophecies, okay, we have Ellen G. White, and we worship on Saturday instead of Sunday, and we have this Levitical foot laws that we follow. So these are the Adventists, right? Isn't it true? So this is all the time they throw the question back to me, okay, isn't it true that this is being Adventist, right? But then when I ask them, so what is the Chinese part? And then the answer always comes up that, oh, because this is our family religion. We inherit this faith from our family. So this is the Chinese, right? Chinese people are very family oriented. And this is a community, this is a religion that the family community hold us together because of this religious faith. So this is the Chinese part and this is the Adventist part. And when we put them together, this is their self-understanding of their ecclesial identity.
Terrific and succinct answer. I'm going to start answering some of the questions that we have in the box here. So coming from Washington, Professor Anthony Clark asks or says, this is a marvelous book project, and you can read along too, Professor Chow, I think in the box. And a study of SDA in China or Chinese SDA is long overdue. Question, the Chinese Christians I know commonly criticize the notion of schism or fenlie as negative division, but you seem to suggest that denominationalism can be viewed in a positive way. How do most Chinese SDA view schism within their own denominations? Can you say more about how Chinese Christians perceive fenlie in a larger context of the Christian church?
Yes, thank you for the question, Tony. And I'm so glad that you are here because I have learned so much from your work. And yeah, it's a good question, right? Especially when it comes to Christian community. And we have this strong biblical notion that a church that belongs to Christ should be unified, right? And that's why when we talked about division, then people would always think that, okay, division is bad for the Christian community and it's bad to divide the body of Christ, right? So I took that notion to the field and I was preparing to hear negative comments on their own experience because this is a very painful experience for a Christian community to see that, okay, they are not just divided into two parts. So we are talking about different branches of Adventism and different organization of the local community. But then I learned from the Chinese Adventists that I interacted with that, okay, there is some positive aspect about it, because if we insisted, they told me that if we insisted on gathering together, there was no way for us to resolve these quarrels and arguments happen during the Sabbath worship. So in the book, I document one example, how the quarrels and fightings happened in one Sabbath morning. And that was the moment that they decided, okay, we have to divide. We need to separate ourselves because it just ruined our religious life. So I think the positive aspects nowadays for the Chinese Adventists is, okay, looking back the history, dividing the church is bad, but because we decided to separate, and that give us some peace to develop our own church and to do our own evangelistic work. And so there's a positive aspects and a negative aspects. But also to approach this question, I can also talk about the methodology, right? When we discuss schism, I think methodologically, the term schism helped me to think that the dynamic of the division. So there is a positive dynamic that you offer a chance for the disagreeing parties to develop their own work. And there are many, in the literature, there are many books writing on those positive aspects. And then I think methodologically that allows me to write the positive effects of these schisms.
Great. Along a similar line, Stephen Hu is joining us from Santa Barbara, I believe, also has a question about methodology, a big question, right? About even the framework of schism. To what extent does the schism in Seventh-day Adventism in Wenzhou mirror, reflect, embody the larger fractious nature, as well as the political and cultural project of Christianity in the West, especially Protestantism as conceived and practiced in contemporary North America? And he ties this to a second question, a second methodological question. You talked earlier about a jigsaw puzzle in describing Seventh-day Adventism. So how do you see your particular piece adding to the puzzle of, as the other Dr. Chow mentioned earlier, the larger puzzle of Chinese Christianities in the plural, or even Christianity at large?
Well, thank you for the question, Steve, and it's so great to receive your response in this event. And then the question is, yes, another methodological questions. How does Seventh-day Adventist schism mirror or reflect the larger fractious nature in the project of Christianity in the West? And I think methodologically, I have to admit that the literature in the West helped me to conceptualize the Chinese, this division story in Chinese Christianity. So interestingly, people who are familiar with the Adventist movement in North America and mainland China can say that even Seventh-day Adventism in America and in North America, there are many dynamics. One dynamic is how they are divided, not organizationally, but in terms of the theological tendency. So some North American Adventists gears towards, okay, we should put more emphasis on grace rather than 10 commandments, because the fourth commandment, worship God on the seventh day, is a unique doctrine of the Adventist globally. So I think in one way, I was informed by this American Adventist dynamic. And it is so interesting that the religious vitality of this American Adventist also is mirror in the Chinese Adventism. I'm not sure whether I'm answering question. I'm trying to compare the two Adventists in two geographical region. And so the second question is about the jigsaw puzzle describing the SDA. How do you see this particular piece add to the larger puzzle of Chinese Christianities and Christianity itself. Yes, a puzzle, right? I think I like this metaphor because it also tells something about the series, right? Christianities, it should be plural because it is a puzzle that we need scholars to dig out the special pieces in this puzzle so that we can have a larger picture and we can have a complete picture, right? Yeah.
That's great. And it's a similar question that Professor Stephanie Wong from Valparaiso has also asked. But I'd like to go back to another question from Professor Andrew Tompkins from Andrews University, our friend to the north, great Adventist institution. Can Christie speak to some of the challenges of getting at the data for the book? And you spoke earlier about this being a search for your roots and your own kind of positionality toward this topic. In other words, how hard or easy was the ethnographic research aspect of the book?
Yes, thank you for the question, Andrew. And thank you for coming. My Adventist colleague and Andrew itself is a scholar in Adventism and global Adventism. So the methodological challenge that I encountered when I did field work, I think I consider myself being lucky because I began the field work in 2009. And then I went back to the field in 2011. And my intensive field work was carried out in 2012. So before 2012, and we all know that the current president took power in 2012. So I was lucky because before the archive, there were restrictions in the Wenzhou archive. I was able to collect some materials in the local archive. But then I realized that archival research is helpful, but it is not enough because I'm trying to understand a very current phenomenon. So I have to do field work. So I think the first challenge of entering the field is I knew nobody in the China field. I was born in Hong Kong, and I grew up in Hong Kong, and I speak a little bit Mandarin, but then that's it. But because of my church work, I work in the church in the Adventist denomination in Hong Kong. So I had some connection with the Chinese community, but I still need somebody to introduce me to the field. So what are you going to ask, right? So first of all, the challenge is whether the church organization in Hong Kong would support my research. And luckily, even though they were quite hesitant to introduce me to the field, because as somebody would have thought that division, well, documenting a division, the church division is, are you going to show a negative picture to the world that the Adventist church is not doing so well in China? But then I was able to convince them that there is a need for the scholarly community to understand the Adventist community. And the book, my research, will be very important for the world to know how the Chinese believers have been doing. And so I convinced them to introduce me to the field. So this is the first challenge that I was able to overcome. And then the second challenge was, while I was in the field, I had to explain to my to the Adventist that I was trying to understand their history, their story, even though they felt so painful to remember those stories. And every time when I tell them that, okay, I'm going to let the world learn that even though there are many branches, there are energy in this community that the outside world can learn from. And I think I was able to convince them that, okay, we are going to help you to finish your project.
Myself. That's great. I think I want to, we have about 6 minutes left, and I think I'm going to try to get in 3 in 1 question, to get 3 questions in at once and end on this topic of what Seventh-day Adventism in China can teach other Seventh-day Adventists and the world. But I have a cluster of questions here, and I think they fit together. Eric Miller writes, you have expressed that Adventism is a family religion, and this is a result of Chineseness. Can you identify other explanations for why people are Adventist? And Dr. Fenggang Yang, our friend at Purdue, says it's great to see this book being published, and You said many SDA say this is their family religion. So again, a question about familialness, but also has questions about converts. So what is the proportion of converts among SDA in China today? Recent baptisms, have they had baptisms in recent years since 2018? Carrie Kosal has a similar question about the synicization policy. For those of you that don't know, there's a huge campaign in the PRC right now to try to synicize and grasp more direct control of religious policy from above. To what extent has that impacted the SDA community? What does synicization look like for them? How have they responded?
Okay, thank you for all these wonderful questions. So I think it will take some time to answer all those questions, but I do like to respond to the question about why Chinese are interested in this Protestant minority faith, right? Why, what can what has and what can Adventism offer to the Chinese? And I think for me, when I talk to the informant, most of the time, it was the fact that the eschatology of Adventism is attractive to the people. Other than they inherit this religion from their family, for some of the other people, when they heard from the Adventists that the world is going to end, Christ is coming back so soon, and this is a chance that you reorient their life, and there is a way that Adventism can help you to reorient this life direction. And I think that is part of the attractiveness to the Chinese community. Of course, there are other reasons that some experience faith healing and some experience friendship in the community, but I would single out the eschatology. And that is why this is a unique denomination, because they have something that other Protestant tradition in China will not offer or will not bring out to their everyday life.
What about recent developments? So are they growing? Are they shrinking? And how are they dealing with the synicization policies? And what unique synicization policies apply to them?
Okay, so the recent development of the Adventists in China, I think they are going along the same line with other Christian community, which is, so once the public religious activities were allowed in the 70s, same as the other Christian community, they grew, okay, the line is running like this, okay, but then over time it stagnates, okay. Right now, I don't have the recent figure, but the official figure is 400,000. But then my informant on the field reminds me that, okay, there is no way you can collect you can have a clear picture statistically about the population. Nobody knows. But then from their experience, okay, because of urbanization, because of other social challenges, the church is, at least they describe their spiritual life is running down, okay, but the figure nobody knows, okay. Synicization, that's a good question. I have not been able to reconnect to them, so I'm not sure whether how they respond to this new campaign, and that's why I'm looking forward to go back to do some more research. And when I know the answer, I'll let you know by my publication.
To be continued. Well, I want to thank all the panelists here today. I want to especially thank the Liu Institute and everyone working behind the scenes to bring this global conversation to the rest of the globe as well. I want to thank University of Notre Dame Press. I want to thank Christopher White, Christie Chow, Alexander Chow for joining us today. There is a coupon code that is being promoted in the chat box. So if you are still with us right now, please check out 40% off for Dr. Chow's book. But I want to give the final word to Dr. Christie Chow and ask her, what is the most important thing Adventists in the US can learn from our Adventist brothers and sisters in China, if there's one thing that stands out from our friend John Sharp?
Well, I think what the American Adventist community can learn from Chinese Adventists is the fact that Chinese Adventists are very thankful for the effort of the missionary bringing this faith tradition to them. But now they are ready to move this faith forward in their context, and they are very happy to make this faith more vibrant in their own country, and also making this Chinese contribution to the global Adventist community. And I believe that they would like to the American Adventists know that we are ready to really be part of this global Adventist community.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.